With us now, Washington Post reporter Arelis Hernandez in El Paso, Texas. Eleanor, an immigration attorney, past president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley, and Krish Vignarajah, president and CEO of Global Refuge, which helps refugees settle here in the United States. So, Arelis, you were with migrants in Ciudad Juarez when they found out about their asylum appointments being canceled. There's that video that you recorded of how they reacted to the news. Let me go to that. Arelis, what was that moment like?
Well, to tell the truth, there was a lot of shock at the beginning. Like, people didn't know how to react. They were looking for confirmation, either through friends and family or from us or Mexican officials who were coming down the bridge to deliver the news. And it was shock. And then as slowly as time progressed, people realized that their opportunity to enter the United States had evaporated with the executive order.
And so the CBP One actually shut down, and then also, Arelis, the appointments that had been already agreed to were canceled as well.
That's correct. A lot of the people who were in line at that time, they would have been for the 1 p.m. appointment, and so they had gotten there early, and actually CBP officials on the bridge had told them to come back at 11 a.m., and they had stood waiting in line, something that happens every day at 8 different ports of entry. They were still on the impression that they still might be able to come up the bridge, but last Friday, actually, many of these people received a notice on the CBP app that they had been reprogrammed to February 8th or February 9th as well. So some people are still holding out hope that this suspension is temporary.
Yeah, and Julia, my question would be, is that suspension temporarily, as some hope for? I mean, what happens to the people who had already received appointments through an app, which is the way the government, until yesterday, told the people this is the way legally to deal with trying to ask for asylum.
Right. Well, they were incentivized to come this way. And as we know, because of a legal pathway through that app and through other legal pathways the Biden administration set up, there was a sharp decrease in the number of people trying to cross the border illegally. They were told, this is the way, get in line. And now they've come to the end of the road there, and that's why you see that devastation. Now, if it's up to the Trump administration, they don't want to ever see this app again, and they wouldn't on their own restore these appointments. But there is a legal challenge. We just saw yesterday the ACLU asked for an emergency hearing here at a federal court in D.C., saying that this judge can no longer allow CBP One to be canceled, along with some of the asylum restrictions the Biden administration already put in place. Because CBP One was the one argument the Biden administration had to say, look, we do still allow asylum. So with this canceled, it effectively ends this international right for people to claim asylum when they're fleeing fear and persecution at the U.S. border. So that's something the courts are going to have to grapple with now, Jose. If this is canceled, what window, what opportunity does anyone have to actually escape fear and come to the United States?
Yeah, I mean, and Krish, I mean, there are very few avenues for people who are trying to leave their areas and come to the United States to request asylum. I mean, one of the issues, of course, Donald Trump, also another executive order yesterday, suspending that refugee resettlement program, which was a bipartisan supported program. What is the impact of that?
It's going to have huge implications. You know, when President Trump signed the executive orders, he highlighted how he supports legal immigration. When you think about the refugee resettlement program, this is a program that has operated over more than 4 decades. We've resettled as many refugees under Republican administrations as Democratic administrations. President Reagan resettled over 600,000 refugees. These are people who go through extreme vetting. They go through health clearances. They wait their turn. And only when they are processed do they come into the U.S.
Right. So this is from outside the U.S. The process begins, and it begins, middle, and ends before they even enter the United States. And so who are those people that have been coming in?
So these are people from Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo. They cross an international border. They apply through the United Nations or through the U.S. Embassy. And so thousands are now paralyzed because they waited their turn. They went through the legal process, and now the program has been suspended.
And Jose, I'll just say on that too, the language in that executive order was so vague. It says that the refugee admissions program is suspended until it aligns with U.S. interest. That's a very nebulous goal to reach.
Yeah, and Alan, another issue that was brought up yesterday by the president in his executive orders was to end birthright citizenship. I mean, it's part of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The president says that this is something that has to end. Is this something the president can actually do unilaterally, Alan?
So for law school and everything I know as a lawyer, he cannot. And I think it was the biggest cry last night for civil rights lawyers and immigration lawyers to assemble to sort of help fight back some of these attacks on the Constitution. It is not something that he can do. And furthermore, we should understand that an executive order does not level up to the Constitution, laws or regulations that are currently in practice. They are unfunded. There's no personnel, there's no policy, and there's no purse behind many of the things that he said last night. They were basically just prayers of his and all just a function. He could not institute 200 policies across this big institution when he's removed the heads of most of these institutions and sort of get some effective thing done.
And so, Alan, what is the importance and the significance of birthright citizenship?
Well, as an African-American born in this country, it's everything to me in the history of civil rights within this country and sort of the equalization of people born here. It's also the foundation of our country. We have 180 years of precedent that says that this is the way our country will receive people who are born here. Part of the problem for me is if we are really solving for immigration, then we won't have the problem of people being born in the country that don't have a legal right to be here. And if people don't have a legal right to be here under the executive order and they don't fall under the Constitution of the United States, then how are we able to remove them? How are they subject to any of our laws if we don't see them as citizens or in operations under our sovereignty? So there's a lot of problems within the legal construction of the document that I'm sure the ACLU will point out, but also just as a fundamental issue. This is what our country has been based on for a very long time. And much like many of the other Supreme Court cases, I mean, we saw Roe versus Wade fall. Hopefully, the 14th Amendment will not go the same way.
Krish, what are your biggest concerns?
I think I'm troubled by the fact that aside from the designation of cartels as terrorist organizations, this is a gift to cartels. When you essentially institute executive orders that are entirely about deterrence, you are not supporting a legal pathway to come into the U.S. You're essentially pushing people who are coming from the most extreme circumstances to rely on human smuggling operations. And so I think I worry when President Trump says companies are going to come to the U.S. We already have 8.1 million jobs. When you tell someone who's here on an H-1B visa, right, like the IT engineers who are working with our AI companies, that you can no longer assume birthright citizenship, you're upending a system that has been placed.
You know, I want to ask you about that, and Julie, I want your opinion on that too, because the designation of the cartels in Mexico as terrorist organizations, as well as the Mara Salvatrucha or MS-13, as well as the Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan group. It's interesting to watch that the Maduro government had some reaction immediately to that as well. Not true, but what is the issue with declaring people organizations that indeed do have they're the enemies of the United States? What's the problem with designating them as terrorists?
Look, I mean, so when you go after these clear gangs operating on U.S. soil, absolutely, that's the role of ICE. But we also have a principle of posse comitatus, where you don't want domestic troops to be operating in the interior. We saw President Trump under the first administration want to deploy U.S. troops in Minneapolis. That's not the role of armed forces. So yes, we need to go after these gangs, but we also need to do it in a legal fashion.
And I'll just say as well, I mean, when you talk to people in the Mexican government, this is an absolute red line. If it opens up any kind of role of what we see of how, the U.S. has been able to use drones on terrorists that are designated overseas, if there's any kind of military action into Mexico would then want to reinstate its sovereignty, that is not what the U.S. can be allowed to do. Now, the U.S. military in the past has gone in and trained Mexican forces, and they've been able to combat cartels that way. But training versus actually going in and enforcing and arresting and killing is completely different.
Claudia Sheinbaum has talked about it. Talked about it yesterday in her morning. The President of Mexico talked about it in her morning news conference, talked about it again this morning. But the fact is that is something that is going to be really interesting to watch, how the United States and Mexico deal with an issue when the United States government labels people that are right there and that in much of the country control parts of the country. How do you deal with them?
Well, and of course, what the Trump administration might be thinking is, look, Mexico needs us for trade. We can do whatever we want there. They're ready to come in and really strong-arm this relationship. But they're missing a key piece in that the Trump administration is entirely dependent on Mexico for immigration enforcement. Mexico tripled their interdiction of U.S.-bound migrants.
Trump said yesterday to the MPP.
And so they haven't agreed to that. They took, we'll back up a second there. Trump announced that he would remain in Mexico, and that came unilaterally. They did not have an agreement with Mexico to start taking back those migrants as they had an agreement in the first Trump administration. So if they don't agree to that and there's a hurdle there, they're really going to mess up relations if they start going after
The president of
cartels.
Mexico did say that she was already planning on how to deal with that unilateral decision of the United States if Mexican repatriations start. And I'm just wondering, Arelis, what are people on the ground there saying in El Paso about the promised ICE raids that many thought were going to begin today, among other places in Chicago, but that have been delayed, but could start any minute now?
Yeah, in El Paso and in cities across the country, you have coalitions of organizations, immigrant rights, attorneys who are just telling people to remember to, what their rights are, that immigrants still have, documented or not, have due process rights in all of this. They don't have to open the door if they hear a knock, and it might be Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so, without knowing exactly how this goes, because immigration raids are not exactly supposed to be predictable, people are bracing themselves. But in some communities, you will see people sort of lighter foot traffic, people deciding to stay home, perhaps, instead of taking their kids to school or going to work at the regular hours. And so I think we don't know how or what will happen to these communities as this plays out.
Arelis Hernandez, Eleanor, Julie Ainsley, Krish, Vignarajah, thank you very much for being with us. Really appreciate it.